Good day, everyone. It is Oliver Jones again, and today we are going to talk about how to prototype game mechanics and a game loop. So the goal for today, before you start the next video, the goal is that your team has a working prototype of either a game loop or some game mechanics. So today we're going to cover what game mechanics are. If you're totally new to game design, this is probably a good place to start. Although some of the more seasoned kind of game designers might find some useful prompts here. And we will also cover, I should say, what a game loop looks like. This is arguably a bit more advanced, but beginners might benefit from some of the insights and prompting here as well, and they might be willing to take it up themselves. I'd recommend that your pitch includes at least one of these elements. That's either a detailed description of a game loop or a detailed description of game mechanics that work with your scenario to achieve your transformational learning goals. And if you get to the point where you are developing a game loop with your team, you likely have some game mechanics that would structure the player's experience of going through that game loop. So what is a game mechanic? A game mechanic is simply the rule or system of rules that defines what players can do, how they interact with the game world, and how the game responds. A game mechanic is essentially the interface that drives gameplay forward for the player. A game mechanic defines what players actually do in the game, how they make choices, and what the consequences of those choices are. So I should be clear about this. Mechanics aren't the story, and they aren't the scenario for your game. They're the engine underneath the story. If the story is a timeline, a narrative timeline of what happens to players, the mechanic describes how that happens. In a low-fidelity tabletop prototype of the kind of game concept you're currently working on, a mechanic might be as simple as, drawing cards from a stack of cards that have been randomized. It might be about navigating a map. You could roll dice to decide on outcomes. It might be about spending resource tokens, or it might be about negotiating with players. What matters for our purposes today is that the game mechanic creates a player's experience of tension. It confronts players with choices and dilemmas, or it might, enable movement or discovery on a map. I should stress the mechanic should be connected to the transformational goal of your game. For example, a game that is about teaching players about how to work with opponents would probably feature a mechanic that requires players to negotiate with other players about shared or competing priorities. But this is just one example. So if you're new to this game design process, I've got a table of some tabletop-friendly ideas for designing a simple game mechanic. For example, you could use randomness as a mechanic for your game. To do that, you might use dice. You could use randomized cards, in a shuffled deck of cards. You could use a spinner wheel, something like that. And the idea there is that each one of these would introduce unpredictability into the gameplay. So, for example, players might draw event cards, representing climate events or climate disruptions that force tough choices on the player for each turn. You could introduce a resource management mechanic. So players might manage tokens, for example, of supplies that they need to meet their mission, of energy that they need to make moves or make trades. Our game Project Inner Alliance, it has a community trust meter, and depending on the choices that the players make, that can go up and down, and it can make their tasking more difficult. But basically, players would manage tokens and make decisions about how to allocate them. For an example of this, if your game is about long-term investment and climate adaptability, if it's about balancing short-term survival versus long-term climate adaptation, a resource management mechanic would probably fulfill that. You could introduce a trade-off mechanic. This might involve presenting players with two or more difficult narrative choices, each with consequences for the player and their own goals. You could, and this is an interesting one, you could introduce the asymmetry between players' roles, or you could introduce hidden information. This would giving players different roles with conflicting priorities or partial knowledge is kind of the idea here. So, for example, you could have two players who are playing as part of the same organization in the game world, but they have different mandates. They need to collaborate, but they have different win conditions. You could introduce a timer, or you can introduce an urgency mechanic. The idea here is that by limiting time or the number of turns players have, they feel pressure to make decisions. So, for example, players, need to make a certain number of successful moves before a climate tipping point is reached. And lastly, you could introduce system mapping or territory control. You could use a game map or a board to represent, locations in a fictional world or elements of systems. And you would let players move pieces, place markers, so they could block each other, that kind of thing. Okay, so ideally you'd want to link your mechanic to your game scenario and its transformational goal, which you developed in the previous video. And it's probably a good idea to ask yourself a few prompts in order to think through how to do this. So what kind of experience do you want the players to have in this scenario that you've already designed? What kind of pressure, what kind of dilemmas and tensions will help them engage with the transformational learning and the transformational insight that you want your game to provoke? And what simple action, what rule, or what kind of feedback loop will bring that revelation to life for your player? Bring that gaming experience to your life for your player. Okay, so into the more advanced stuff. So what is a game loop? A game loop describes the core cycle of gameplay. A game loop is the repeating sequence of actions that players perform throughout the game. You can think of it as the temporal backbone of the gameplay experience. A game loop, in essence, creates a sense of rhythm and game flow. It structures how the game feels when you play it, whether the game experience is, fast and reactive and you got to make snappy decisions, or whether it's slow and, methodical and strategic, or whether it's somewhere in between. The game loop is also the engine of player engagement. The loop keeps players engaged by presenting them with challenges, decision points, giving them feedback and a sense of progression over and over. It's something that they'll repeat over the course of gameplay. So this is a general design consideration to keep in mind as you work through this part of the challenge. A good game loop tends to balance reward and challenge. If it's too boring or too punishing, the player will probably tune that experience out. So this visual here is an example of a simple game loop taken from one of our own games, AOD's own game, Inner Alliance, which I talked about in the last video. So this visual gives you a sense of how each mission progresses and what that cycle looks like in gameplay time. The players, as you'll see in this diagram, they start with a mission briefing, which tells them what it is they're supposed to do, what they're aiming to accomplish. They select their team. They select from members of a kind of cast of characters that would be well suited to this mission. Excuse me. They play the mission on the level map. The players complete the mission, or they don't. They can fail, which is an important feedback mechanism. And then finally, after the mission is complete or not complete, there's a facilitated debrief with the game master about the choices they made during the mission. Mapping something like this out with your own team can help you visualize how your game mechanics work and how your players experience the world you've imagined for your game concept. If you want to test your game concept and your game mechanics, mapping it out like this as a sort of sequence can be very helpful. So within the game loop for Inner Alliance, there's a kind of sub-game loop that we call the mission loop. This is because the experience of playing a mission for the players has a turn sequence of its own with various steps, which are mediated by how the player chooses to engage with the game mechanics. For the tabletop version of Inner Alliance, the mission loop also has two distinct roles. There's the role of the game master, which is in the left-hand column of this diagram, and there is the role of the players themselves, who are in the right-hand column. Your game loop, I should stress, it doesn't need to be as complicated as this one or as complex as this one. It's worth pointing out that this is the game loop we're looking at here is the game loop from a complete game that has gone through a fair deal of testing. I'm just showing this more to show you the elements of the game loop as you work to develop your own. Okay, so some prompting to help you build the game loop. You can think of your game loop as the repeating rhythm that shapes what players do, kind of decisions they make, and how they feel the consequences of those decisions throughout the course of gameplay. Another way to think about this would be the game loop is the repeating cycle through which the player experiences, the game's details and events, the details and events in your scenario, your game scenario. So it's in essence, it's the structure that gives meaning to their experience of playing the game, and is therefore foundational for realizing your learning goal. So as a team, you can ask yourself, what does a single round of gameplay look like? What are the repeating actions that players take? You can ask something like, where are the key decisions your players are going to face? When do players make meaningful choices that relate to your game's learning goals? Where are the points of feedback? How do players know whether they've succeeded or whether they've failed or whether they're progressing or whether they're falling behind? Lastly, where's the tension and where's the sense of reward? How does each cycle maintain the player's curiosity, their sense of urgency and emotional investment in the game world? So this is just a sort of general design tip. Your loop doesn't need to be very complex. It just needs to be clear and purposeful. You don't need multiple sub loops or branching paths or anything like that. A simple loop with meaningful variation is often more effective than a complicated one. And this is just a sort of a tip. Again, if you're trying to visualize this as a team, it's probably a good idea to sketch your game loop on something like a Miro board, especially if you're all working remotely. Miro is an interface that will let you coordinate that online. Use boxes and arrows to show the repeating steps in your game, and this will help you visualize how your mechanics support player engagement and ultimately your transformative goal. Okay, so that's the end of part 2. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how to develop a game artifact, like a game map or a character sheet or a game card, and how to tell your game story in a game pitch. I should note here that we will, in fact, be compressing parts 3 and 4 into a single video. So there's only one more video coming. Okay, thanks very much for listening.